Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the Minister and to your staff for being here today. I've got lots of questions, so I'll just dive right in. Looking at the Ministry Business Plan, page 126, pretty much the entire page, but really the first four key strategies. What I see when I read these key strategies is I see words like continue to work with housing providers, other orders of government, etc. Invest in a sustainable housing system through regeneration, renewal, supportable housing, in collaboration with other levels of government and housing providers. So the words housing providers are listed throughout, and that's certainly something just to be on the record in terms of my perspective on that. Those housing management bodies you talked about, there's a tremendous amount of work that goes on through the not-for-profit community, through government partnerships, and that granting model, which in my opinion has actually worked very well for a number of years. But then I look at page 27 of the fiscal plan, and I also reflect on some of the words that you have said this morning, and we've seen a shift in direction from this government to previous approaches. About the middle of the page on the fiscal plan 27, budget 2018 has $256 million delivered through Alberta Social Housing Corporation, and then there's a bit of a breakdown there. So I just appreciate some commentary from you, Minister, on the disconnect which appears to be going in two different directions. On one hand, on the business plan, we talk about collaborating with housing bodies and housing providers, but there seems to be in the fiscal plan and some other things that signals you've sent a government-first approach, more of an investment model than a granting model. Can you perhaps offer some commentary as to how you square those two seemingly conflicting approaches?
MLA Clark, can you just refer to what you mean in the fiscal plan? Because I don't see what you're
So right in the very middle of page 27, budget 2018 has $256 million delivered through Alberta Social Housing Corporation, which I believe is under your ministry.
Yes.
And I'm just curious if that delivery through Alberta Social Housing Corporation represents a shift in approach from previous approaches. Just appreciate some comments.
No, the Alberta Social Housing Corporation has been, is a sort of the standard mechanism we use to allocate funding, and it's not only for public, but it's also for that nonprofit sector. So I don't really understand the discrepancy you seem to be identifying. Certainly, we know that a lot of nonprofits are providing very specialized housing care, and we do work with them to support them, but we also work with our public system also in terms of delivery.
Okay. So there seems to be some either confusion or perhaps just a lack of details around the $1.2 billion provincial housing strategy. There seems to be more questions than answers at this stage. So perhaps you can help me break that down. Of that $1.2 billion, have you allocated a certain portion that will be handled through government investment? How much will be handled through grant funding? How much is through new builds? How much is for maintenance and capital stock renewal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly we want to... So certainly our government has had a focus on investment as opposed to grants. And we still do some granting, but we are concerned that when we were granting, that we didn't have an equity share, and that those housing units would then go back to the market and not provide affordable housing. And that was a concern that we had when we were looking at how the system had been set up before. Certainly, we still have investment. I mean, the Indigenous the Indigenous housing strategy is certainly going to be grants, because that makes more sense to support the Indigenous community. They talk to us very much about ownership, so we're there's not one size fits all. We are being responsive to the community, and so we do have a mix of investment and grant.
Okay. So I just want to follow up on your comment that you said, in the past, the grants have resulted in those going back into the market, or words to that effect. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I heard something like that. Do you have some data that you can share with us on the specifics of that? If there are certain numbers of doors, certain projects, which have not met your expectation in terms of outcomes?
Well, I mean, these expectations were set previous. So, I mean, the previous government set expectations regarding their housing program. So they're not our expectations. But one of the expectations was just 10% below market, which for a lot of the vulnerable Albertans that we're serving, that's not enough. That was not really reaching the vulnerable Albertans we wanted to. So, but that was all that was required by the previous expectations, the previous agreements. And certainly also, too, there would be a limit on how long they would be available to, like, 10% below market. Then it would be back, it would be completely at market.
So what percentage does that reflect of the total dollars that are spent by seniors in housing? Because I'm not suggesting for 1 second that what you're saying isn't true. I'm sure it is absolutely true. I would just appreciate some context. Is it 0.5%? Is it a small little portion? Is it 95%? I mean, I just appreciate some scale in terms of...
Yeah, and I mean, that's something that, as the agreements do expire, we can give you more data on that. Well, go back.
Yeah, I'd really appreciate if you could table that information in the House at your earliest convenience, because I'd just appreciate if we're going to be making broad sweeping changes to investment models, or well, and I use the term investment models very generally, then I think knowing that we're doing that from a position of good data, I think is pretty pretty darn important. So I think perhaps what I'll do then, move on to so one of the concerns I have when I think about these changes that are coming or in the works is one, just a lack of clarity in terms of and information being put out to the sector itself. I'm concerned that perhaps they don't have all the information they need to be making their decisions, and I'm also concerned that in the investment model, because you're not, as I understand it, you can confirm this for me, the housing management bodies are still in the mix as the managers of these facilities. Is that correct? Or even if it's a government investment model?
Oh, absolutely. The housing management bodies manage the facilities across the province.
So is there any concern then that they may change their model and there may be some unintended consequences here, because there would be a risk that those contracts could be revoked perhaps at short notice? That the risk is now being downloaded to those bodies. They may choose simply not to participate in certain cases, and we may in fact not achieve what we're trying to achieve here?
Well, housing management bodies are created by ministerial order. So certainly we've set out the parameters on, how they function. So that is something that, they work under those directions. So they can't just end a contract like that. It's different system than that. It's a ministerial order.
Okay. So there's a lot of money that's been attracted in Calgary in particular by the Resolve campaign. Is there any concern on your part that some or any of that money would perhaps be revoked if the province moves more to an investment model than a granting model? I mean, that money was raised under certain expectations by the donors. Is there a concern, or do you feel there's any risk that any of the projects that will be funded by Resolve campaign dollars would be at risk based on changes from a granting to an investment model?
So certainly, Resolve is a very unique situation in Calgary. And Calgary's, I just want to give accolades because it's a unique model, and certainly the private industry, along with nonprofits, have really come together to, look for a solution in their city. And so we have met with Resolve many times, and our government has funded this year. We gave them $30 million for, was that last year? Oh, sorry, last year was $30 million in investment for their projects. And certainly, as I said, there's not one size fits all, and so we can be flexible. But, certainly Resolve is a unique situation, and we just did commit to $30 million last year to support that project.
Thank you. And are there any concerns on your part going forward that any other, is that something that you anticipate continuing to support going forward, or was that 30 million, is that it?
Well, the Resolve campaign's over. I mean, it finished at the end of March. So, that campaign's over, and it remains to be determined what if there's going to be future steps in that. But we're certainly happy to talk with the stakeholders in the community about initiatives. But that project is complete.
Does your ministry work with community and social services or other departments to support the 10-year plan to end homelessness and its successors? And are you in support of of the Housing First model?
Well, certainly, actually because there's overlap not only with community and social services, but also with health, in terms of housing needs, that we do have, a collaborative table of department staff and ministers making decisions about some of those that fit in sort of both or all three areas. Certainly, our new provincial affordable housing strategy that I announced last year has created a ladder process from homelessness into affordable housing. And so that was something that was very important to us, because before this was created, there was kind of a drop-off point from Housing First that didn't give people access really into the affordable housing sector, because an affordable housing is really sort of defined as housing that is more about income, not having the income. It's not so much about homelessness, like the wraparound supports that people need to be able to be well housed because of vulnerabilities like mental health, addiction issues, those kind of things. So that is something that we work with Minister Sabir about, and certainly the Housing First model has been shown to be important, across North America to support people to be well housed.
So, just to that point, there's obviously, in all ministries, they touch each other in different ways, and there's overlaps, and it seems though, especially true of seniors and housing. So you talked about you talked about a cross-ministry table. Can you just tell me a little more about that, and if that's something that can potentially be plugged into by stakeholders within the sector? And some of the things that I've heard are some challenges both from just Albertans themselves, but also stakeholders never quite sure which group to talk with on certain topics. Is this feedback that you've heard, and if so, is it something that you could plug them into, or there's something that can be done to help stakeholders and Albertans navigate what's a fairly complex system?
Well, certainly, at the level we're talking about, when the ministers meet, then the projects that are being asked to go forward have already probably had several meetings with individual ministers at that point. So it's not really at that level, but certainly the provincial affordable housing strategy, we have stakeholder involvement in all the steering groups that is involved with. I meet regularly with stakeholders regarding projects that they want to go forward, as I know Minister Hoffman and Minister Sabir do. So at that level, I would say that that's not the appropriate place, but if people are having trouble navigating the system, certainly the department staff, I'd be happy to help people understand that if there is some difficulty. And sometimes we can also because, as you said, things aren't discrete. There is a little bit of overlap that if they need some access with health or something, we can facilitate that. So, we absolutely want to be supporting stakeholders to be able to access it and not be wasting their time. So, happy to further assist with that.
Okay, so I'm going to dive into some numbers here. Now, page 128 on the business plan, we look at capital investment under Alberta Social Housing Corporation. The budget in 17-18 was $258 million, roughly, but the forecast is a spend substantially less, only $172.6 million, but of course now the estimate in this year. It looks like that there's some investment that was intended in last year that has shifted into this year. Can you tell us why that is? What specifically has not happened as a result of that? Are certain specific projects delayed?
It is because we did convert some of the investment into grants, $30 million.
So $30 million it makes up not quite half of that number.
Okay. And there was some delays, that sometimes does happen. I mean, these are complex projects, and things don't always go completely ahead. And there was 55 million carried forward into the next fiscal year.
So most of it was carried forward, okay? So I'd like to spend my next chunk of time here trying to unpack where the $1.2 billion investment actually is within the budget numbers, because I'm having a hard time counting the $1.2 billion, but that's perhaps just me. So let's start on page 63 of the fiscal plan and the capital plan. We have $144 million for seniors housing development and renewal. And family, social supports and housing is adding up to $524 million over 5 years. Just curious whether that full $524 million is part of the $1.2 billion. All of that factors into the $1.2 billion?
Yes.
Okay. So we're about halfway there. Where can we find the rest of $1.2 billion through the budget?
Do you want to just explain? So I'm just going to let my senior financial officer explain the details on this.
Sure, thank you.
So in budget 2016, it was the $1.2 billion was the allocation for 5 years. Over the past 2 years, most of that money's been spent. This particular plan you see on page 63 is just the family, social supports, and housing. There's also on page 62, there's $247 million for the capital maintenance renewal. So there's that aspect, and then there's a small amount also in the capital, in the climate leadership plan on a further page. So, and then the plan has been extended a little bit. So the $1.2 billion is like over 7 years.
It's over 7, not over 5. Okay, that's obviously a very important detail.
And we've also completed about 1,343 units in that time frame.
Okay, and so how much has been spent to date of the $1.2 billion?
Not that exact number. No, that's a 5 year.
Going forward.
Yeah.
That would, want me to answer?
Yes.
So the fiscal year hasn't completed yet for 17-18, so we'll have more information when the annual report comes out in June.
Okay, so perhaps I'll ask that sneaky way of asking the same question a different way. How much is yet to be spent?
This is it.
Same deal.
This?
But that's the 5 year. Yes,
So you-
that's it. Go ahead.
So 755 million over 5 years going forward is still left to be spent.
Okay, so we have $755 million left to be spent, but that's over 5 years, including this fiscal go forward. So the $1.2 billion, which was to be spent over 5 years, is actually going to be spent over 7 years. So what I hear is 755 from this fiscal
No, he said 7.
through the next 5 years, inclusive of fiscal 18-19. Yes.
I'm just clarifying with my SFO here, but the 755 is over 5 years? So it is over 5 years.
Starting in 18-19,
Yes.
this fiscal from 5 forward, and then that means you spent 445 in fiscal 17-18 and 16-17.
So,
Go ahead.
Darren, say your name, please.
Darren Baptista. So in 2016-17, we did spend 141 million in investment, and there was also capital grants included in that, which I don't have right on me. We can get back to you with that one. And then this year, in 17-18, excuse me, the year just closing, there was $258 million of investment allocated. And of course, as you mentioned, the $173 million was the adjusted investment figure, and there's about $78 million in capital grants in 17-18 also allocated. So, yeah, those
But
two numbers
the
combined.
but the $1.2 billion was announced in summer of 2017, is that right?
2016.
2016,
Yeah,
okay,
it was
okay.
2016.
Okay, good, okay, that's helpful. Okay, so when we go back to page 63 in the capital plan, and maybe we'll have to come back to this when I get a little more time here, but I couldn't help but notice as we go 5 years out, 22-23, that most of the money goes to zero. So senior housing development renewal will spend $0 in 22-23. Can you speak to, are we going to do no seniors housing development renewal in 4 years' time?
Okay, so John Thompson is going to respond.
John Thompson, ADM Housing. So the reason for that is because in the investment model, you must select the projects first. So it's not like a grant program. In a grant program,
I hesitate for the interruption. However, the time allotted for this portion of the rotation has expired. At this